hear me? I'm just going to share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we were looking at the feasts of the Lord, and so today we will continue with where we left off. But before we do that, I just want to revise back a few points that we were studying in the past weeks. We just to as a reminder that we are studying the book of Leviticus, and the main theme of the book of Leviticus is be holy for I am holy. That is the theme of it is the continuing theme in this book. And within this theme is what we are studying, the feasts of the Lord. We saw many different things from this book. So other thing that we noted was that in the New Testament, Peter refers back to the book of Leviticus to urge the New Testament believers to live a holy and pure life. He quotes, "Be holy, for I am holy," from the book of Leviticus. And in the book of Leviticus, we are looking at everything about holiness. And the purpose of holiness is so that God can dwell with us. So God can have a fellowship with his children. So that is the purpose for which God gave all these different rules and commandments to the people of Israel for holiness. Then we looked at the book of Leviticus and how it was divided. There were two parts. The main two parts was the first chapters 1 to 17 was about how to approach God, and the remaining chapters 18 to 27 was about how to walk with God. So once you have approached him, now how we will continue that relationship, how we walk with God. So within the chapters itself, we could see it is very nicely divided about offerings and sacrifices, priesthood, what are clean and unclean. Then there is one whole chapter about Day of Atonement, then common and holy, worship, sanctions and vows. All these different sections are there in the book of Leviticus. Then about the feasts of the Lord, which we'll come to later, uh, we saw another concept about holy and clean and unclean. We saw that something which is holy is not only clean, but it is separated to God. So it is its whole purpose is to serve God. So if it is not serving God, but if it is just clean, it is for secular use. It's a good thing, but it is for common use. But when something is clean and it is separated for God, it is consecrated for God, it is called as holy. So when something is holy, if we do not use it in the way it is supposed to be, we are profaning it. And when something is clean, when we use it for something bad, we are polluting it. So in the opposite direction, if there is something unclean, we can cleanse it and it can become clean. And if there is something clean, we can consecrate it and then it becomes holy. So this is what we saw. Then we saw about sacrifices, 5 different sacrifices, how they are offered. So 2 are compulsory, which is about sin and trespass. The others are voluntary. Then we saw all the different things about the sacrifices. And when we looked at the sins that the sacrifices covered, we saw that only unintentional sins are covered by the sacrifices. Intentional sins are not covered by the sacrifices. There is no sacrifice for intentional sin. Even in the New Testament, we read in Hebrews chapter 10 that if we go on sinning willfully, there is no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. And even when we look at the advocacy of Jesus, that we know Jesus is our advocate, and when he was one of the instances of his advocacy, when we see on the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." So it's an unintentional sin, even though they are doing something terrible, it is unintentional, and that's where Jesus's advocacy comes in. Then later we saw one very important thing, that the whole thing that we must remember, it's about him and it's not about us. We are created and we exist for him. Okay, we are not for ourselves. So we looked at different parables and we saw that there is an expectation that everyone should be working for the Lord. Even though God is blessing us, providing for us, taking care of us, there is an expectation that every person should be involved in working for the Lord, in serving the Lord. Then we came to the feasts of the Lord. So we saw that the word feast in the original language, the word used is moadim, which means an appointment, an appointed time. So we saw that the feasts of the Lord are basically appointed times of the Lord. So these are the appointed times when Israel was to come into the presence of God to worship him. But we also saw something which was underneath this, which may not have been visible to the people of Israel at that time, that these appointed times were the times which God had chosen to fulfill major prophetic events. So this is something that we got progressively as the words, the God gave revelation. We came to understand that these feasts are appointed times of the Lord for fulfilling major prophetic events. And we saw the different feasts and we are going through them. So this is the thing that I was showing before. So the feast can be divided into two parts. The first four feasts were fulfilled in the first coming of Jesus Christ, and the next three feasts will be fulfilled in the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the first coming is the Passover, then the unleavened bread, Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Pentecost. So we saw the timings of how these feasts are celebrated. Now, coming to the timings, we looked at the Jewish calendar. So the Jewish calendar, their months have their own names. So this feast, it's starting with the Feast of Passover. It happens in the month of Nisan. So it is an 8-day festival. Okay. So in this 8th day, the first day is the Feast of Passover. Then the next day, 7 days are called as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Passover is not a Sabbath. The first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath, and so is the last day. Feast of First Fruits is celebrated on the weekly Sabbath, the day after the weekly Sabbath, which occurs during this 8-day period. So this is something that we saw already, and I believe you would remember that you are remembering this. So then we looked at Passover. In Passover, God changed the calendar. So whatever calendar they were following, Passover occurred in the 7th month. And God said, now from now on, this month is going to be the beginning of your year. So from then on, Israelites have two calendars. One is the civil calendar and the other is the religious calendar. So we know that we also follow multiple calendars. Okay, we follow the Gregorian calendar, we follow the school calendar, we follow the financial calendar for different organizations or the countries. So in our own life, we follow different calendars. So Israel follows two calendars. One is the civil calendar and other is the religious calendar. They have the same months, but the order of the months also remains the same, just that the 7th month becomes the first one in the religious calendar. So I had shown the religious calendar and the civil calendar, if you can see it. In the civil calendar, the first month is called the month of Tishri. The 7th month is called as the month of Nisan or Aviv. In the religious calendar, the month of Nisan becomes the first month, followed by the rest of the months in the same order. The order does not change. Only the month designation of the month, only that changes. Now, when does this feast occur? Passover occurs on the 14th day of the first month of the religious calendar. So on the 14th day of the month of Nisan is the day of Passover. On the 15th to the 21st day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this is also in the month of Nisan. The Feast of First Fruits is celebrated on the first Sunday after the weekly Sabbath. So there will always be a weekly Sabbath in this 8-day period. We have a 7-day week, and if we have an 8-day festival, there will be at least one weekly Sabbath. So from the Feast of First Fruits will be on the day after the first weekly Sabbath. If there are, it's okay. So, and after that, so we looked at Passover, we looked at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we looked at all the details. Now we were looking at the Feast of First Fruits. So I think this is the portion that I went through a little hastily last time. So let's look at it again. So the Feast of First Fruits, what happens during that time? The person from the harvest, it is a harvest festival. So harvest time. So the person will bring one sheaf from the harvest to the priest, and the priest would take that sheaf and wave it before the Lord. And that is what happens during the Feast of First Fruits. Now, if we look at the interpretations, we saw last time that a sheaf can represent a person. So one of the examples we looked at was the dream that Joseph had. In Genesis chapter 37, verses 5 to 8, we read about Joseph having a dream. And in that dream, he said that, please listen to this dream, which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf stood up and also remained standing. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. And then his brothers became really angry because they correctly interpreted it. Their interpretation was correct when they said, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more. It was very obvious to the brothers and everyone what it meant. Joseph is going to rule over all his brothers. So even Jacob scolded him for that. So in that dream, he saw a sheaf, and the sheaf represented him, and the other sheaf represented his brothers. So a sheaf can represent a person. And when we look at harvest, harvest can represent those who put their trust and faith in the Lord, and also the end of the age. So Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 to 38, I will read these. It says, seeing the crowds, he felt compassion for them, because they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, plead with the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. Here, Jesus looks at the people, the crowds, and he calls them the harvest. Then in Matthew chapter 13, verses 38 to 40, he speaks another parable, and in that he says, and the field is the world, and as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the weeds are the sons of the evil one. and the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age. So in this parable, Jesus mentions that harvest is the end of the age. So these two things are used interchangeably, and we must understand it from the context of the from the context what it means, whether it's representing the people who are putting the trust in the Lord, or whether it is representing the end of the age. So saying harvest and harvest time, there is being used interchangeably. Now, these parts we did not see. The theme of the feast is resurrection and salvation. So there are many things that have happened during this particular period of Feast of First Fruits, or even this Passover period. We can say is during this 8-day Passover period. Noah's Ark rests on Mount Ararat. So Genesis chapter 8 verse 4, it says, then in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. So in the 7th month, and this is using the civil calendar, this is the month of Nisan. This is the 17th day. 14th day is Passover. 15th day is Feast of Unleavened Bread, and all the way up to 21st day. So the ark comes to a rest during this Passover period. Israel ate the fruit of the promised land during the Passover period. Okay, Joshua chapter 5 verses 10 to 12. A pastor has mentioned this many times while he has preached. There is this one particular time or one single day when the people ate the fruit of the land, and they also ate the manna. So it was during this time when the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal. They celebrated the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. Then on the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and roasted grain. And the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land. So on the day after they have eaten the produce of the land, the manna stopped coming from heaven. And this was during the Passover period. The other thing that we mentioned was in the book of Esther, the enemy of Israel, the enemy of Jews, Haman, is defeated. Let's read the book of Esther. Somebody please help me. Esther chapter 3 verse 7.
In the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is the Lord, before Haman from day to day and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month Adar.
And read verse 12.
Then there were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written and sealed with the king's ring.
So we read the 7th verse to show that the first month which they are referring to over here is the month of Nisan. So in the 7th verse, it says in the first month, which is the month of Nisan. Then in verse 12, it says the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. On the 13th day of the month of Nisan, the scribes were called, and there this message or this decree was written, which said that all Jews in all the provinces must be killed on certain day. So that was the decree. And it was given on the 13th day of the month of Nisan. 14th day is Passover. 13th day, this decree was given. So what happens next? Next, we read that Esther fasted for 3 days. So it was from 14, 15, and 16. She fasted along with all the people. They fasted on these days of Passover and unleavened bread. And either on the 16th day or the next day, she went and stood before the king. So the Israelites were delivered from sure destruction during the Passover days. And so when she stood before the king, she then invited the king and Haman for a feast. Then she invited them again the next day. And the next day, she said to the king that Haman wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and the king was furious, and Haman was killed on the same day. So we see that during the days of Passover, a great deliverance was given to the people of Israel. And the most important thing that happened during the days of Passover is that Jesus Christ died and rose again. This is the fulfillment of the feast. This is the fulfillment of the feast. We see that other important things did happen during that period. But this is the reason, this is the main thing, this is the thing, this is the shadow of the feast is all about. So Jesus rose again on the feast of first fruits. How do we know that? In Mark chapter 16, verse 9, it says, when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, every gospel mentions this, that he rose on the first day of the week. And we know that he was crucified on the day of Passover. So the first day of the week after the Passover is the feast of first fruits. So he rose up, he was resurrected on the feast of first fruits. Now let's read John chapter 12, verse 24. Gospel of John chapter 12, verse 24.
Verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit.
So unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. And 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20 says, but the fact is, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. So when Jesus Christ rose up, he rose up on the day of first fruit, on the feast of first fruits, and he is designated as the first fruit of those who will be resurrected after he has risen up. So Jesus Christ is the first fruits of those who are asleep. So he was the grain which fell into the earth, died, and is now bringing forth much fruit. Okay, and Jesus fulfilled the feast of first fruits by becoming the first fruit of the harvest of resurrection that is to come. Okay, so now there are two things, and now there are a lot of verses that will follow. There are many, many verses, but one idea that we need to understand is this theme of firstborn and first fruits. The firstborn of people or animals, or the first fruits of any harvest is holy to the Lord. When we say holy to the Lord, we mean it's separated and belongs to the Lord. Okay, so the first fruits were always the choicest. They were always the best. They are the foremost, and they are the preeminent of all that would follow. The best of the best is taken as the first fruits and offered to the Lord. It is not the last thing from the harvest, but the first thing, the best thing that is given to the Lord. And we'll read some of these verses. Exodus chapter 23, verse 19. Can we read that? Exodus chapter 23, verse 19.
The first of the first fruits of thy land thou shalt bring into the house of the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seethe a kid and his mother's milk.
The choice first fruits of your soil you will bring into the house of the Lord. There are other verses in Exodus itself, Exodus 23:16, Exodus 34:26, which says, you shall bring the very first of the first fruits of your soil into the house of the Lord your God. It keeps on repeating. God keeps on repeating that it has to be brought into the house of the Lord. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 to 10, there is a very detailed thing about how the first fruit must be offered to the Lord. And when the person brings the first fruit from his harvest to the Lord, he recounts his origin. He says, a wandering Aramean was my father, referring, it is in verse 5. It says, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt and resided there, few in number. But there he became great, mighty, and populous nation. And they recount all these things year after year, whenever they are bringing their first fruit, as a thanksgiving to the Lord who has given them this harvest. So verse 10 says, and now behold, I have brought the first of the produce of the ground, which you, Lord, have given me. So they acknowledge that it is the Lord who has given the harvest, and as a thanksgiving, they offer the first fruits of that harvest. Later in other verses, we see in Second Chronicles, we see people giving their first fruits. In Nehemiah, we see people giving their first fruits. In Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9, we read, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. As a command we see, but the other things are incidents how people voluntarily gave to the Lord. In Ezekiel, we see chapter 44, verse 30, that first fruits were, how the first fruits has to be given. Let's read this one, Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 to 12. Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 to 12.
But truly I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of judgment, and of might, to declare unto Jacob his transgressions, and to Israel his sin. Hear this, I pray you, ye heads of the house of Jacob, and princes of the house of Israel, that abhor judgment.
No. This is Malachi chapter 3.
Malachi, sorry.
Will a man not rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, said the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, said the Lord of hosts.
So here God is rebuking the nation of Israel for not bringing in the tithes and offerings. Okay. So we need to remember that this is a very important concept or commandment that we need to remember to follow. Now, the reason we went through all these verses, out of some of these verses, is that Because the Lord says the firstborn and first fruits are for the Lord and is holy unto the Lord. Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 to 2, it says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Sanctify to me every firstborn, the firstborn of every womb among the sons of Israel, among people and animal alike, it belongs to me. So there is a reason. There is a reason that this firstborn and the first fruit is given so much of importance. So when we look at Jesus, we see that he is the firstborn of God. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5 to 6. Can we read that? Hebrews chapter 1, verses 5 to 6.
For unto which of the angels said he at any time, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee? And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall to be me a son. And again, when he bringeth in the first begotten into the world, he says, And let all the angels of God worship him.
So when he brings the first begotten or firstborn into the world, referring to Jesus. So we see that Jesus is the firstborn of God. Next we see he is the firstborn of all creation. Colossians chapter 1 verse 15 says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Okay. Next we can see he is the firstborn from the dead. Revelation chapter 1 verse 5 says, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler over the kings of the earth. So he is the firstborn of God. He is the firstborn of all creation. He is the firstborn from the dead. He is the firstborn among many brethren. Romans chapter 8 verse 29 says, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. He is the first fruits of the resurrected ones. We already saw that. But now, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 to 23. But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So we saw that. And lastly, he is the preeminent one. Colossians chapter 1 verse 18. Can we read that? Colossians chapter 1 verse 18.
And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence.
Preeminence. So we see that Christ is the firstborn from the dead, and he is preeminent over everyone and over everything. There is no one like him. He is above all. So the reason we can understand when we look at the first fruits and the reason God assigns some importance to the firstborn, they are all a reflection of Jesus Christ. We see that Jesus is the firstborn of God. He is the firstborn of all creation, firstborn from the dead, firstborn among many brethren, first fruits of the resurrected ones, and he is the preeminent one. Okay, so we understand why there is such importance to first fruits and to the firstborn. Okay, because it's a reflection of Jesus Christ, and it shows how the relationship God has with Jesus. Now, the next thing we will cover next time, it's the Feast of Pentecost. We have already run out of time. So next feast, hopefully we shall cover in the next week. Thank you, Pastor. Over to you.